about a 40-second delay.
Good morning, Dan.
About a 40-second delay.
Good morning, Dan.
About a 40-second delay. Don't worry about this. It's just the mouse catching up.
Hi, Dan. Good to see you. Okay. I got your email. I will answer the emails today or tomorrow. But of course. I mean, yes. We got. I think we are getting that. I think we're getting that. Good to see you. Okay. I got your email. I will answer the emails today or tomorrow. But of course. My family. It's going to be like family and beach. I think in the south. We are getting that. Matera. Yes.
I looked it all on that, and it really is just like 2 pounds over where my grandmother is from.
Okay.
Castellaneta.
Castellaneta, yeah, I know. I've never been there, but it's very close to. I mean, I know the name. It's very close.
This year that my grandpa fell ill.
Yeah.
But it was pretty good.
Yeah, in Puglia. This is Puglia. Depends on probably the newer generations, but not the older generations. Castellaneta, yeah, I know. I've never been there, but it's very close to. I mean, I know the name. It's very close.
This year that my grandpa fell ill.
Yeah.
But it was pretty good.
Yeah.
But it was pretty good.
Yeah, in Puglia. This is Puglia. Depends on probably the. Oh yes, no. We talked with him and about her. Yes, no. Actually, he got me to read her. Yes. Yeah, no, it's demanding reading sometimes, but it's rewarding as well. Extremely rewarding. Yeah, in Puglia. This is Puglia. Good morning, Rita. How are you? Depends on probably. Oh yes, no. We talked with him about her. Yes. Actually, he got me to read her.
Yes, I think.
Yeah, no,
When Monday, Wednesday. But that's usually Sundays.
Okay. Yeah, tonight. We can try Monday. You want to try on Monday?
All right.
Okay. I just said thanks to your.
Okay. All right. Another thing you do, I honestly do it.
Okay.
I live there.
Thank you, Rita. You appreciate it.
So I've shared my screen. Can you?
Okay. I can see your screen.
Yeah.
The problem is that we are still not there with the YouTube at the moment.
With the YouTube.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah. Want to get that. But yeah, no, I see the screen.
So what I could do is like, this is one option to just have this program open so the slides are there. Or what I can also do is I can put it on a kind of full thing. So I've shared my screen. Can you?
Okay. I can see your screen.
That's a bit neater, isn't it? Maybe.
Yeah. Okay. We got that.
That's
We got
okay.
it. Yeah. So we got it on our screen. This is your first page, the first page of the.
Yeah. So what
Okay.
I could do is like, this is one option. To
So
just
I don't know.
this
Probably it's
program
better to
open so
start
slides
without
are there.
the
Or what I can also do
PowerPoint,
is,
and then you start it at so that
I
people
can
start
put it
seeing
on a
you.
kind of full thing.
Okay. So
Can you?
there you are.
I can see your screen.
Okay.
That's a bit neater, isn't it? Maybe.
Amazing. Yeah. Okay. Amazing.
Just
So
so
we
you know, we're live.
we
This
got
is
that.
what
We
people
got
on
that.
YouTube are seeing.
Okay.
So we got this on our
This
screen.
is your first page, the
Yeah.
first page of the.
Yeah,
So what I could
basically.
do is amazing. Okay, so we start in 5 minutes. Without the
Okay,
so I'll give you a short
then you-
introduction and then we go on with the
Yep.
with the talk.
Ruth,
Sounds great.
Ruth, I would just turn your microphone and
Okay, amazing.
camera off until you're ready to start. This is what people on YouTube are seeing.
Okay, thank you. I'll turn my
Yeah, basically.
amazing. Okay, so we start in 5 minutes. Okay, so I'll give you a short introduction and then we go on with the
Yep.
with the talk.
Ruth,
Sounds great.
Ruth, I would just turn your microphone and
Amazing.
camera off until you're ready to start. This is what people on YouTube are seeing.
Okay, thank you. I'll turn my
Yeah, basically.
amazing. Okay, so we start in 5 minutes. Okay, so I'll give you a short introduction and then we go on with the with the talk.
Ruth,
Sounds great.
Ruth, I would just turn your microphone and
Amazing.
camera off until you're ready to start. This is what people on YouTube are seeing.
Okay, thank you. I'll turn my amazing. Okay, so we start in 5 minutes. Okay, so I'll give you a short introduction and then we go on with the with the talk.
Ruth,
Sounds great.
Ruth, I would just turn your microphone and camera off until you're ready to start. This is what people on YouTube are seeing.
Okay, thank you. I'll turn my Good morning. Good morning, everyone here, and good morning to all the people who are following this lecture via the live stream. So today we have the last of our church, social justice and civil society lectures, which with the symposium we had in May, were meant to help us to think about outreach, about how the church can and should be present in civil society and should reach out really. And the interest of this has been, as you know, that a group of a substantial group of parishioners have gathered and are reflecting on these things and are starting really to think about how practically to do social outreach at this stage of the history of our community. Now, today, for this last lecture, and one of those I was very much looking forward to, we have someone we have already invited in the past and was a dear friend, and it's always a pleasure to be with, is Ruth Jackson Ravenscroft, who is at present at Cambridge, the University of Cambridge in the UK. She's an undergraduate tutor and Weil Fellow in Theology, Religion and Philosophy of Religion at Sydney Sachs College. She's a theologian and philosopher of religion whose research is focused primarily on 19th century Germany, but also engages the themes of gender, experience, and dialogue in theological writings. She's the author of The Veiled God, Friedrich Schleiermacher's Theology of Finitude, and has co-edited with Simone Goldhill Victorian Engagements with the Bible and Antiquity, the Shock of the Old. As it happens, Simon Goldhill is a very good friend. I've been at his home several times. I've celebrated Shabbat with him and his family. So it's really like his family coming together. So it's really a great pleasure. And you know, we are going to talk about one of the most fascinating figures of the 20th century. Someone I have to say I discovered only recently. It's only recently, and actually because of one lecture Ruth gave for the previous parish where I was, where you did mention, you know, you did say, read The Need for Roots by Simone Weil. I did, and I kept doing it, and this has immensely widened my perception of things, especially what she says on providence keeps like nagging me, I have to say. So let's just go into this lecture on social justice, civil society, and Simone Weil, and listen to Ruth. Thank you, Ruth.
Thank you so much, Luigi. It's really good to be with you. Thank you so much for the invitation. When I lecture normally, I normally really annoy my students because I tend to walk about the room. So it's taking all of my concentration today to root myself on the chair. And if I keep looking to my side, it's not because I've lost interest in you all, it's because I've got my other computer screen up here with all my notes on it. It'll remind me what I'm saying to you. So today, yes, I am going to talk about Simone Weil, who may be known to some of you already, but if she isn't, I'm excited because, as Luigi said, she's a really big influence on a number of thinkers writing today. She is someone who people disagree over greatly. She's quite a controversial thinker. She's a very illuminating. It'll remind me what I'm saying to you. Time with. Today, yes, I am going to talk about the way I wanted to begin today is by talking about a little saying that is attributed to the American writer Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., who was a physician polymath and one of the fireside poets. And he said something like this. He said, "Some people are so heavenly minded that they are of no earthly good. They're so heavenly minded that they're of no earthly good. And we might translate this to the maxim, don't be so heavenly minded that you are of no earthly good. Now, the reason I thought it was worth starting with this is because it sort of gets to a few connected issues and it triggers a couple of thoughts that are relevant to Simone Weil. On the one hand, you might take this quote in the direction or spirit of a kind of Marxist critique of religion. So if we're too heavenly minded, that is to say that you're being diverted away from focusing on social justice issues in the present. If you're heavenly minded, you're sort of being distracted from worldly issues, things that should be captivating you. So we might remember Marx's line that religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. He says it's the opium of the people. So in this characterization, religion becomes this kind of symptom, this release from social pressure. But in this context, Marx says it can be a really bad thing to be religious because you can fail to divert your energy into the present day, into revolution, into social change, because you're too fixated on the heaven above. So that's one way when we could sort of think about this idea that you shouldn't be too heavenly minded because you can be of no earthly good. The other way we might take this comment is we might think of it in terms of that otherworldliness that the saints present us with. We have this sense that to be a saint is to sort of tread lightly in the world. And we can think of a number of characters like this. There is your Dorothea in Middlemarch. If those of you who have read Middlemarch will know that Dorothea is this very idealistic creation of George Eliot. And she sort of is very idealistic. She has all these really bold ideas about how to live charitably in the world. But nevertheless, this gets her into all sorts of scrapes and struggles, and she ends up in a very difficult marriage, for example. One of my I've been told that we have a bit of an audio problem. Yeah.
Ruth, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. We have a little echo. Do you have
of George Eliot, and she sort of very
No, she can hear me now, but can you do you have the volume on?
But nevertheless, this gets her into all sorts of scrapes and struggles. I do, but on my one of my I've got my headphones in. I've been told that we have
Your headphones? Is that the headphones probably?
Yes.
Yeah. Because we have an echo.
There can't be any loop on mine because the audio's coming through into my headphones.
Okay. You can hear me now, but
And your volume's off.
do you have
Is
the
this
volume
on?
on?
But nevertheless, this gets her into all sorts of scrapes and struggles. Do, but on my
It would music.
on my one of my
Okay, let's try again.
I've got my headphones in. I've been told that we have
Your headphones? Is that the headphones probably?
Yes.
Yeah. Because we have an echo.
There can't be any loop. Is that any better? Because the audio's coming through into my headphones.
Okay.
And your
Okay,
volume.
try now.
Is this on?
Is this better if I'm speaking now? Is it the same problem? On my
Okay, let's try again.
I've got my headphones in.
Your headphones? Is that the headphones? All good. You can carry on. Because we have an echo.
Cool. Is it working now? Is that any better? The audio's coming through into my headphones. Okay, good. So shall I just keep going from where I was? Would that be? Yeah. Okay. Is this better? Lovely. So we were talking about George Eliot and Middlemarch, weren't we? I was saying there's this idea that we can think of saints and figures in the world who sort of tread very lightly, like your Dorothea in Middlemarch, who's very idealistic and who has all these plans and ideas for how she can be charitable, but they don't seem to come off very easily. She's a bit clumsy with them. I wanted to share a little quote with you. Oh, is there still a problem? George Eliot and Middlemarch, weren't we? I was saying there's this idea that we can think of saints and figures in the world who sort of tread very lightly, like your Dorothea in Middlemarch, who's very idealistic. It's all good. Okay. I thought I'd share this quote with you as well, which is from Simone Weil. She says, "I wanted to share we have to be Catholic in our love. That is to say, not bound by so much as a thread to any created thing, unless it be to creation in its totality." So if we're going to be Catholic in our love, she says, we can't be bound to anything in this world by so much as a thread. And I think this sort of gets to this kind of otherworldly presence, that to be a kind of saint in the world, to do just things, to live charitably, to reach out in this sort of way, is that you can't have partiality to anything. You need to love everything. You need to love universally. And this too can mean that saints of this kind can be very difficult people. I have a very brilliant student this year who chose to write about the novel Les Miserables for one of their projects with me. And in Les Miserables, my student was telling me how there's this character, Bishop Muriel, who's the Bishop of Dean. And this bishop does really grand, bold, and magnificent deeds all the time in his congregation. And the author, Victor Hugo, says he doesn't really seem to be aware that they're grand and magnificent deeds. But the problem is that he's doing all of these charitable things, and it's causing his sisters who live with him to become increasingly afraid. So they'll say things like, in order to do these good deeds, he'll take lots and lots of risks. He'll put himself in danger. He even leaves our house unlocked so that at night we're worried about people coming in. So there's this idea to do with that maxim I sort of raised earlier, that if you are heavenly minded, if you are doing things out of love of God, in the spirit of charity, then it can create a sort of a tension. It can create a situation where, as a person, you can be a very difficult person to live with. And I think this is an interesting thought. So when I was first thinking about this talk and thinking about speaking to you and about Simone Weil, I'd wondered whether this maxim that I mention, which I can actually put up on the screen here, I think. Again, if I share my screen, there we go. A very difficult person to live with. So this idea that you can be so heavenly minded that you're of no earthly good. I was sort of wondering to myself, does that not describe Simone Weil? After all, she herself had some really quite radical ideas for policy, charitable and political policy to help people. So she was someone, and I'll get to her biography in a minute, but she lived during the Second World War. And one of the things that she suggested at this time as a kind of policy idea to help the French on the front line is that, the French would be sending in nurses to the front line, parachuting them in to tend to troops without any thought to their own safety and without any weapons, but sort of like there to help. And the exiled president, sort of General de Gaulle, learning of her idea to just send nurses in, said, she's crazy. Where's this idea come from? Likewise, in response to her book, A Need for Roots, which is one of the things that I'll be talking about you I'll be talking to you about today, it is this figure Jacques Sustel, who was at university with Weil. He was asked, why do you think her book, The Need for Roots, was so ignored in her time? This is a book that's only become much more famous after her death. And he said, well, her kingdom was not of this world. Her ideas, we weren't ready for, but they sort of seemed to come as a kind of lightning bolt from the outside. They seem to be so radical. How do we enact them in society? So partly, one of the things I was thinking about, therefore, when I was preparing for this talk is, could we describe Simone Weil via this maxim? Is she too heavenly minded to be of any earthly good? There is a portrait of her as a difficult saint that emerges in some of her biography. So in one case, we find that there's a couple of tragicomic moments. She She, at some point early in her life, after she'd graduated university and had become a teacher, she decided to give up teaching for a year to go and work in a car factory. And her idea was she was so dedicated to learning what it was to be a worker. She herself had come from quite an affluent background, but she really was dedicated to charity and to helping the displaced and the oppressed and those in need. And her heart's desire was to be among those in need and those who were oppressed and those who were working then a minimum wage. So she spent a year in a factory to try and work in solidarity with such people. One of Simone Weil's commentators, Malcolm Muggeridge, interviewed a fellow worker of Simone's many years later, someone who worked alongside her at the Renault factory, where she was employed in 1935. And he spoke of Simone, Muggeridge says, with the utmost affection and admiration. But he said that, she really didn't have any notion of what a worker's life was actually like. And because she was so absent-minded, because she herself was so clumsy, so ill-footed, that she actually failed to become an efficient worker herself. She was actually getting in the way of other people. She was becoming more of a hindrance, a problem to those around her, despite the fact that she was so sort of well-minded. There's loads of these anecdotes, but another quite pertinent one is when she traveled to the front line of the Spanish Civil War, also in the 30s. And she really wanted to help, but it wasn't long after she arrived there that she was getting into all sorts of trouble because she had very poor eyesight and she was unable to contribute to a number of the missions that they wanted to involve her in. But she also spilled a basin of boiling oil down her leg while she was trying to work as a cook, and she completely injured herself and meant that she had to go home again. Her parents came to take her away. So in these sorts of tragic comic moments, we get this really devoted figure, this kind of charitable figure who ends up in the kind of heart of calamity. The more and more she tries to help, the more and more she kind of undoes her willingness. And so we get this idea of her as quite, a difficult saint. She was a bit of a recluse. She was very idealistically minded. And it's very easy to put her in this category, I think, of someone who was sort of so heavenly minded that she struggled to do the kind of earthly good that she wanted to do. But then, as I was preparing this talk, I thought to myself, well, actually, rather than spending all my time sort of trying to convince you that she was a person who was too heavenly minded, I thought to myself, well, actually, there's another perspective that we can have of Simone Weil and her contribution to questions around social justice that I think is actually a much more radical and interesting one. And this is this idea that all, rather than she was someone who, although she was in a real sense, she was mystically minded, she was heavenly minded, she was absolutely abundantly clear that her whole striving in this life was towards the truth. The truth for her was the most important thing. And to love God and to love neighbor was the most important thing. But rather than say that this kind of flattened out her appreciation of this world, the world in front of her, it would be wrong to say that she was too otherworldly in order to have a real presence in this life. So on the current slide that I've got up here is some lines from The Need for Roots, which is the book that Luigi mentioned as he was introducing me. This book that she wrote in exile from France in London in the early 1940s, which was it's a book all about what should France look like after the war, what is going to be necessary in order to regenerate France, in order to make it a place again where people can live fruitfully after the devastation. and awful evil that the war, that the Second World War has brought. And in writing this book and advocating for this idea of rootedness, she's really adamant that it's only through loving things in this world that we can begin to know what it is to love God. So there's this quote here from 1 John 4:20 that she cites. She says, "For he that loveth not his brother whom he hath seen, how can he love God who he hath not seen?" So this idea that if you are not loving those around you, how can you learn to love God who you cannot see around you? So she says it's only through the things and beings here on earth that human love can break through to what lies beyond. So it's with this motif. So although she was this quite otherworldly thing, I want to say that she wasn't someone who wasn't able to contribute on the level of social justice in this world. It's actually that her writings, in a way, give us this sense that in trying to live out the gospel, where we fail to do this, so if we think of the saints as difficult people, as people who it's difficult to be around, the sort of people that leave the house unlocked or and risk their lives on a daily basis, and therefore kind of alienate the ones that are around them and love them. If doing good things comes at the expense of alienating those that we love, if doing good things comes at the expense of being a difficult person, then actually what we are learning from Weil's work is that life in this world at the moment isn't as it should be. There is something fundamentally wrong with our society, is one of the things that Weil is saying. And so when she writes this book about what should France look like after the war, she has this really quite remarkable vision of a place where our obligations towards the people we love and our obligations towards the anonymous neighbor who's lying hungry on the street should not be in conflict with one another. And that actually she wants to build a country and a reality. She wants to sort of indicate to those around her that it should be possible to build a community where loving your neighbor it doesn't sort of breed this kind of set of tensions in your life. And she says this is what our daily lives look like, and they are full of tensions. So here's another quote from The Need for Roots, which sort of I think gets at this. She says, "All Christians know that one day they are likely to hear Christ himself say to them, 'I was hungry and you fed me not.'" She says, "Everyone imagines progress as being first and foremost reaching a state of human society in which people will not suffer from hunger." So here's another quote. "If we ask the question in general terms to anyone," she says, "nobody thinks a man is innocent if, having an abundance of food and finding on his doorstep someone 3/4 dead from hunger, he walks past without giving them anything." So what we sort of learn here is that I think if you're trying to live in the light of the gospel, and this is proving difficult, then this sort of exposes the character of the society that we have around us as alienating to people. If one's life is structured by a 9-to-5 job that places certain demands on us, by the need to be looking after our children, the need to sort of make one's way in the world, if all of that sort of basic stuff we need to do in our daily lives in order to get by, if that comes into tension with looking out for those people who are on the street, then Simone Weil says, we've run into a problem here. Our society is no longer structured in a way that we can do those things fruitfully together. And so we need to come up with a way of critiquing and rejuvenating society so that those things do not fall into tension with one another. It should not be the case, she's saying, that people will suffer from hunger. And she says that we all of us know at the root of ourselves that we don't think someone is innocent if they have an abundance of food themselves, but there are so many people around them in need of hunger. And yet look at the society we live in. This is just constantly the case, and there's something broken. So on the handout that I gave to Luigi to share, there are a few things. The first is that there's a sort of short biography, and what I thought I'd do now is I'd run you through that in a couple of minutes, and then I would sort of leave you with a few quotes that I think sort of summarize some of Weil's big challenge to the society of her time, the society sort of in the midst of World War II and coming out the other side of World War II. And hopefully that will provide you all as you come to the end of your amazing sessions that Luigi's organised. And he's told me so much about your community and your church, and how you have this kind of ongoing mission, the social justice mission that's building and building and building, and it sounds really amazing. Hopefully some of Weil's work can be a kind of an impetus to think even more fruitfully. So just to run you through Weil's biography, I will share my screen again if I can find it. So here we have this will be on your handout in slightly more detail, but as you can see here, as I've already mentioned, she's 20th century thinker. So she's born in 1909 to secular Jewish parents. She was raised very much agnostic, and she sort of held off those questions of religion to later in life. And her elder brother was extraordinarily talented intellect. He was a mathematician, André Weil, and they were affluent family. She herself, like her brother, was very precociously intelligent. And she went to the École Normale Supérieure, really esteemed university, for want of a better word, in France. And she went there in 1928 and qualified as a teacher in philosophy, and also becoming a philosopher herself during that period. But at the same time as she was kind of developing this interest in the ancients, in philosophy, in logic, and in Greek texts, she was also equally interested and invested in this vocation she had lifelong for social justice work and political activism. So at the same time as she left university and became a teacher, she also began to advocate for workers' rights. And this is where there was the episode that I mentioned a little bit earlier, where she worked as a labourer in this Renault car factory. She also travelled to Spain, as I said, to fight in the Civil War. And she did so on the side of the Republicans against the nationalist forces, which were sort of burgeoningly led under General Franco. So she was really fighting the cause on behalf of the left-leaning Republicans. And after she returned to France, after her time in Spain, which unfortunately left with her being injured, she then started to become very ill. You will see from the end of the biography, she died as an extraordinarily young woman at the age of only 34, no age at all. And to think that she left us so many works despite this tiny life of hers, it's really quite amazing. And it was in these years after coming back from Spain. She'd already published quite a lot of essays on social justice by then, but in this period, from the late 1930s onwards, she became a really kind of prolific writer, not one that was famous in her own time necessarily outside of a number of small, quite radical political circles, but she's left us these texts. She left us The Need for Roots, which is the book that Luigi mentioned, this book about what is France going to look like after the war, what should it look like. She left us this set of texts, which is put together under this name, Waiting on God, which I'll refer to a couple of quotes to finish in a minute. And she also left us a whole series of essays and some aphorisms that were put together in the collection Gravity and Grace, which is another very famous collection of hers. On the slide that it's in front of you, perhaps the things to mention here are that in the late 30s, this is the point in her life when she had a series of mystical experiences. So as someone who was raised very much agnostic, in a Jewish household, a secular Jewish household. She went on to become someone who, although it's not clear whether she was ever baptized, certainly there's no record of her necessarily having ever been baptized, and she was quite adamant in her works waiting on God. She writes quite adamantly that she's not interested in being baptized. So she doesn't belong to a church tradition at this point, but she was really affected by scripture, and she had a number of these mystical experiences. The most potent of these was in 1938, where she describes how Christ himself came down and took possession of her. And these mystical experiences were real wellspring for her writings and for her philosophizing in the world. And the other thing to say is that she traveled to the US in 1942 with her family to keep her family safe, and returned to Europe, came to London in 1942 with the hope that she would eventually end up back in France to help with the war effort. But sadly, that was never to come to pass, and she died in England, where she had a desk job, essentially, working for the exiled French government. And it's at that point that she wrote The Need for Roots. So as you can see, a kind of a life lived intensely, but a very short life, and one that ended through illness. She was diagnosed with tuberculosis, and she really had problems with eating, and was very frail at the end of her life. So perhaps here, I know we don't have much time before the end of the session, but I wanted to leave you with a few quotes, and also with a few themes that will help you to understand where Faye's pronouncements on social justice come from, where this image she has of a world that which, we have to love the world in order to even contemplate loving God properly. We must first love the world. And her understanding that the human being needs to be rooted and cared for. In order to understand where all that comes from, I've wanted to highlight two themes, and these are, first of all, self-effacement and self-renunciation, and the second one is obedience and obligation. And in terms of self-effacement, this is just to say that at the root of Wei's philosophy, at the root of what she has to say about why we should love one another, why we should love our neighbor, why we should commit to social justice causes, is her really radical faith that God, in creating human beings, had to make space for something that was not God. So God's act of creation, she says, was an act of renunciation and restraint. It was not an act of self-expansion, she says here, as it says on this quote. She says, creation is not an act of self-expansion, but of restraint and renunciation. She says, God and all his creatures together are less than God alone, and God accepted this diminution. So for her, the act of divine creation is an act of kind of stepping aside, stepping back, allowing and permitting the existence of what is not God. And so God denies himself, just as Christ tells us to deny ourselves, she says. So at the heart of living for God, Faye says, this is a very radical thing, she says, is an act of renouncing self too, just as God takes a step back. So that's at the heart of her philosophy. And the other thing to mention is that the other real prong of her philosophy is that we not only living out a life in love of God is not only about self-denial and self-renunciation, it's about obedience and obligation to that which is not me. So she says, even if I had my eternal salvation placed out in front of me, and I only had to stretch my hand to take it, I would not put out my hand so long as I had not received the order to do so. She says, I want nothing else but obedience. Obedience in its totality, that is to stay even to the cross. So here we can see with these two big prongs that she has of self-effacement, renunciation on the one hand, hand, and obedience of obligation on the other hand. These are the two fundamentals, I think, that really lead into this social justice philosophy that she has, where she talks about the need to be to love one's neighbor. And I think this is the first of the quotes I want to leave you with, which is this at the start of this book she writes called "And the Need for Root." She says, the concept of obligations takes precedence over the concept of rights, which are subordinate and relative to it. She says a right is not effective on its own, but solely in relation to the obligation to which it corresponds. The successful fulfillment of a right comes not from the person who possesses it, but from others who recognize that they have an obligation towards that person. So this is characteristically kind of thick language from Weil, but basically what she's saying is if a society is sort of ordered around this notion that everyone has a right, that's a healthy way to live a society. People do have rights, but that can't be the thing that everything rests on, because she said there's something that's even underneath rights. People only have rights because others agree to respect those rights. Yeah, she says the successful fulfillment of a right comes not from the person who possesses the right, the person who demands that they have rights. If someone's rights are upheld and respected, she says, it comes from others. It comes from those who recognize that that person has rights. So this is why for her, obligation, our obligations towards other people, our duties towards other people, will always be much more fundamental, she says, than this idea that people have rights. And that's what's at the heart of her writings on society. So because we're running out of time, I thought I would just run you through quickly the final couple of quotes that I've given you that are on your handout, just so that, you know, hopefully these are quotes that if you take anything away from Weil, I think these are worth your time. So the first one perhaps is to say that she thinks about love of neighbor, about the work of social justice. She says she thinks this is just like a sacrament. Loving one's neighbor has the virtue of a sacrament, she says. And she says Christ made this clear enough. She says he said that he would one day thank his benefactors, saying to them, I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. But Weil goes on to say, who but Christ himself can be Christ's benefactor? How can a man give Christ something to eat if he is not raised, at least for a moment, the state that is spoken of by St. Paul when he says he no longer lives in himself, but Christ lives in him? This is what Weil says about our obligations to our neighbours, is that they're sacramental in character, because when one gives to someone else, when one gives to one's neighbour, it's not we that are acting, but it's Christ that are acting in us. And so Christ himself becomes Christ's own benefactor in this case. So to be active in society, says Weil, it's a very mystical way of inhabiting social justice. She says it's to be possessed by Christ, to be taken on by Christ and conformed to him, just as Christians are in the sacrament. Because when one gives to someone else, here's another quote. She says, all Christians know, this is the one I mentioned before, that one day they're likely to hear Christ himself say to them, I was hungry and you fed me not. So this idea that everyone imagines progress as being first and foremost reaching a state of human society in which people will not suffer from hunger, and it is therefore an eternal obligation to a human being not to let them suffer from hunger when one has the opportunity to help them. And so having introduced this formula where for Weil, rights become secondary to obligations. She says this is how we can make sense of this point, that we are obligated to help others. We should never let those suffer from hunger when we have the opportunity to help them. And this is how we can make sense of Christ's command and so having introduced this to his disciples formula and how do we achieve this? This is the final quote on your slide, on the slide, but also on your handout. So Weil talks about the obligations that we have to one another, the fact that these are more fundamental than the rights that we have because they underscore those rights. She talks about the fact that human life if we're going to live in the light of the gospel, is about stepping aside. It's about letting Christ enter oneself. And so if we're going to have a society where we can fulfill these obligations, where we can love our neighbor as we love ourselves, where we can live out what it means to love God and one's neighbor together, she says, what must a society look like? And she has France in mind here, in order to kind of allow that justice to take place. And she says, well, we need a society where people are properly rooted, because for her, rootedness, she says, is perhaps the most important but least known spiritual need. So we need to be rooted in community. And so this is the final quote on your handout. She says, a human being is rooted through their real, active and natural participation in the life of a collectivity that keeps alive treasures of the past and has aspirations for the future. This participation is natural in that it stems automatically from place, birth, occupation, and those around them. Every human needs to have multiple roots and to derive almost all their moral, intellectual, and spiritual life from the environment to which they naturally belong. So here, I think, is where I convinced myself that it would be wrong to describe Weil as someone who is too heavenly minded to do any earthly good, because actually in Weil's advocacy for loving that which is in this world as a kind of training ground for loving God, in her advocacy for obligation to the other, in her advocacy for self-effacement, in her advocacy for passivity and obedience, I think Weil comes closer to talking about how do we live now in community in a way that means that we're not, in being more saintly, perhaps, we're not having to appear as difficult in the world. We're not overly idealistic. We're not treading too lightly, but that actually, if we can form a society where love of God and love of neighbor can kind of more closely align, then those things should not be in tension with one another. It should not lie in tension that I'm living a good kind of moral life as an upstanding pillar of my community, but I also have a person who is hungry on my doorstep. Those things shouldn't be in sort of tension with one another. So I hope that that's been a sort of gives you a little bit of a penny for your thoughts on social justice today. And I'm so sorry about the audio problems that we had, but it was great to be with you today. Moral life as an upstanding pillar of my community, but I also have a person who is hungry.
Well, Ruth, you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, this is exactly what and people are uploading here, so I don't know if you can hear them. So this was exactly what I was very much looking forward to. An introduction to something that gives us a sense of what an extraordinary personality Simone Weil is.
Well, thank you very much.
However compact sometimes his thoughts might be, and however shocking. I mean, there are some aspects, you know, I can't get my mind around it. And yet it's immensely stimulating and thought provoking. So especially I would like to unfortunately we don't have time to sort of a proper Q&A, but I just want to leave you with a couple of thoughts highlighted by Ruth. So the first one is this idea that society should be, life in society should be based not on rights, but on obligations, which when you read it the first time, you know, it's something we have become very alien to, because now we live in a society where we are constantly claiming what is owed to me, and owed to the people whose rights have been denied for a long time. So it's always seen with suspicion, the fact that, you know, people say, well, probably rights is not the ultimate foundation of life in society, because rightly, you know, rights of people have been neglected for so long. And yet, a society based only on what my right is generates an extremely conflictual and polarized society, as we see around us. And you know, we can really talk about the crisis of liberalism this is something that liberal and democratic society is under eyes all the time. Why? Because we need really to realize the extent to which, as you pointed out, obligation is much more what I owe to other people. You know, if we all of us paid attention to what we owe to other people, and other people what they owe to us, what is owed to me is not something which I will need to fight for and claim all the time, but it will be spontaneously given to me. So there is really there a kind of a radical rethinking of life in society, but something that I find very, very worth thinking about. And it's just one of the aspects. You know, there are so many others. What you said about creation as restraint, I find also very interesting. And I hope next year we are going to talk about the problem of evil. And I think a take on evil is not easy, but you know, something that really helps to think about it. Just last thing, I spent you know, last month I read this book, and I'm going to send the reference to you. It's a life of I don't know if you are familiar with this, Robert Zaletsky, the subversive Simone Weil, A Life in 5 Ideas. I found it very, very good kind of introduction to Simone Weil, so I'm going to send the reference to you. It's very readable and combines her kind of thought with her biography. And then, you know, obviously the need for roots. If I can recommend you to read it, it's a very yeah. I mean, and our Father Mark, another of the priests here at St. Thomas, keeps talking about the need for roots as being the best book in the world. So people are familiar with this idea. So anyway, thank you very much, Ruth. Really, it's always besides being a pleasure, something that really kind of enriches me and us to be you with us. And we have said thank you to you, and I will be in touch.
Yes, certainly. Thank you all. See you soon. Good morning.